Good day. My name is Francisco Losada Jr., and I'm director of the Borderlands Institute at Brite Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. Welcome to the first of 5 webinar events sponsored by the Henry Luce Foundation for Theology on the arching theme of responsibility and immigration. The modest aim here is to address briefly several pressing social justice issues of the day around immigration, including racism and xenophobia, which we will hear today, child migration, gender and sexuality, and climate-driven migration along the US-Mexico borderlands, and capping off the webinar series with an ethical theological take on responsibility and immigration. Before moving to introducing our guest speaker, a couple of things I would like to mention up front. Once the presentation begins, please include your questions in the chat space. I will do my best to address them and perhaps consolidate some at the end of the presentation, where we will engage in a Q&A session with the presenter. And we will end at the top of the hour. After this event, you will soon be able to register for the second webinar event on October 7th, 11 to 12 p.m. Central Time, entitled Children Crisscrossing Borders in the Americas by Professor Iracema Coronado, Director of the School of Transborder Studies at Arizona State University. So without further ado, allow me to briefly introduce our guest speaker. Professor Natsu Taylor Saito is a Regents Professor and Professor of Law at Georgia State University's College of Law in Atlanta, Georgia, where she has taught courses on international law, human rights, immigration, race, and indigenous rights since 1994. She is currently a faculty affiliate of the Center for Access to Justice, as well as the Department of African American Studies. Professor Saito's scholarship focuses on settler colonialism and the legal history of race in the United States, American exceptionalism and international law, the plenary power doctrine as applied to immigrants, American Indians, and U.S. territorial possessions, and the human rights implications of U.S. governmental policies, particularly with regard to the suppression of political dissent. The author of 3 books and about 50 articles or book chapters, her latest book is entitled Settler Colonialism, Race and the Law, Why Structural Racism Persists, published by New York University Press, 2020. Today's presentation is entitled Race, Migration, and Xenophobia. Welcome, Professor Saito. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Losada. And I also wanted to say thanks, of course, to the Brite Divinity School and the Luce Foundation, and especially to all of you who've taken the time to join our conversation today. It's really an honor to have that opportunity to be with you. I wanted to start with the proposition that stories matter. Stories matter to those intent on maintaining structures of power and privilege, and to those who are being crushed by those structures. In A Way of Being Free, Nigerian poet and novelist Ben Okri says, "In a fractured age when cynicism is God, here is a possible heresy. We live by stories, we also live in them. One way or another, we are living the stories planted in us early or along the way. Or we're also living the stories we planted, knowingly or unknowingly, in ourselves. If we change the stories we live by, quite possibly we change our lives." Today, I'd like to talk about some of the stories we're living and the ways in which we might want to change them. I'm talking to you as a Japanese American from a family deeply scarred by internment during World War II, and as one whose immediate family members identify as Black, white, and indigenous, as well as Japanese American. This background has motivated me to try to understand the dynamics of racialized power and privilege in this society. I'm speaking to you from Atlanta, where I'm on Muskogee land from which most of the Muskogee Creek Nation was violently removed, land that was transformed into the property of European settlers and rendered profitable by the labor of enslaved and otherwise exploited people of color. That's not a story that everyone wants to talk about, but I don't think we can have a grounded conversation about race or migration or who has a right to be here without being honest about whose land we're on. I've been asked to address racism and xenophobia in the context of migration, It's a big topic, of course, and I can't hope to do it justice. But I do hope to sketch out a framework for you that I've found to be useful. As we look around us, it's hard to believe that a decade ago people were debating whether the United States had become a post-racial society. In recent years, we've seen torch-lit parades and the takeover of government buildings by overtly white supremacist groups, highly militarized responses to indigenous water protectors and Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and a dramatic rise in assaults on Asian Americans. Muslims, Arab Americans, and South Asians continue to be conflated with terrorists. We've also seen increasingly vitriolic anti-immigrant sentiment, along with the construction of a massive border wall. Refugee admissions have plummeted to new lows, and migration from some countries has been prohibited altogether. Immigration detention averaged over 50,000 people a day in 2019, and migrant families and children continue to be held in private prisons. More generally, the United States has less than 5% of the world's population, but 22% of its prisoners, and they are, of course, disproportionately people of color. Our institutions purport to encourage diversity, equity, and inclusion, but statistically speaking, racial disparities are just as stark now as they were in the 1960s with respect to housing, education, employment, and healthcare. Among many other things, this means that about 1/3 of Black and Native children and 1/4 of Latinx children live in poverty. Despite massive protests here and around the world, the rate at which police are killing people of color has not dropped since 2015. It's hard to absorb these realities, and it's tempting to fall back on the story we've told ourselves for so long, that progress may be slow, but things are getting better, inevitably. The problem is that in most respects, they really aren't. The only way we're going to bring about real change, I believe, is to acknowledge that the solutions we've attempted thus far have not worked, to look honestly at the underlying causes of racism and xenophobia, and to come up with strategies that address the roots as well as the branches. We spend a lot of time talking about what's wrong with racism and xenophobia, and I'm assuming that if you're here today, you probably have a good idea of what's wrong with them. So I'm inviting you to join me in thinking about why they've been so persistent. What functions or purposes do they serve? So let's start with how we got races as we know them in the first place. Europeans arriving in North America thought of themselves as English or Irish or German or Dutch, not as white. Africans as Yoruba or Tigre or Wolof, not black. Indigenous North Americans as Osage or Haudenosaunee or Lakota, not Indian, right? These categories were all constructed, and they can't simply be attributed to geographic origins. On the face of it, there's no logic to a system that limits whiteness to individuals of exclusively European ancestry, defines persons with but one drop, so-called, of African ancestry as black, and uses lists created by white government agents in the 1880s to recognize or deny recognition to indigenous people. Some stigmatized peoples have become accepted as white, others never can. Some groups have been disappeared, others get highlighted as perpetual threats, and still others are sometimes our friends and sometimes our enemies. Race, as John Powell put it, is best understood as a verb rather than a noun. There's no logic in how racial identities have been assigned to people unless we look to the reasons these classifications were created. And to understand the purposes of racialization, it helps to think about some material realities, particularly land and labor. Land was the first priority of the English settlers who became the founders of this country. Their story was that North America was vacant, but in fact it was perfectly obvious that people lived here. Lots of people, an estimated 15 to 20 million people in what's now the continental United States. Racializing American Indians as savages, beasts of prey, to quote George Washington, allowed the colonizers to use genocidal means to disappear indigenous peoples and to appropriate their lands. Legal claims to real property in the U.S. here now still rely on Johnson versus McIntosh, a case that was decided by the United States Supreme Court in 1823. There, two white men claimed ownership of the same parcel of land, one tracing his title to its American Indian owners and the other to a grant from the British Crown. You can probably guess who won. In explaining his decision, Chief Justice John Marshall relied on the doctrine of discovery for the proposition that European colonial power making the first contact had an exclusive right vis-a-vis the other European powers to negotiate for the land. He then said that because, according to this European legal fiction, American Indian nations could not, quote, dispose of the soil at their own will to whomever they pleased, they could not really have owned it. Tacitly acknowledging that this was about raw power and not law, Justice Marshall noted that conquest gives a title which the courts of the conqueror cannot deny. But he also went on to say that these principles he was articulating may find some excuse, if not justification, in the character and habits of the people whose rights have been wrested from them. And what were those character and habits? As summarized by one of his colleagues, American Indians were simply, quote, wandering hordes held together only by ties of blood and habit, and having neither laws or government beyond what is required in a savage state. My point here is not simply that the colonizers invoked racist stereotypes to remove indigenous peoples from their lands. It's that the land itself only became property, that which could be held, legitimately defended, and alienated when white men claimed it. So real property, like identity, is a racialized construct. The settlers' ongoing desire to claim as much Indian land as possible resulted not only in the physical elimination or removal of indigenous peoples, but also in a crazy patchwork of laws governing American Indian identity in increasingly restrictive ways. Thus, for example, the federal government imposed blood quantum rules to determine indigenous peoples' eligibility to receive land under the 1887 Allotment Act. The point, of course, from the government's perspective, was to reduce Indian land holdings and open up reservation lands to white settlement. So the standard most often used was 1/2 or more blood quantum from a particular nation. So even though Indian was used as a racial rather than political construct, someone could have 4 so-called full-blood grandparents from 4 different nations and not be recognized as an Indian. By contrast, we have what eventually emerged as the one-drop rule with respect to people of African ancestry. The colonizers were appropriating indigenous lands in order to render them profitable or productive in John Locke's framing, and quickly turned to the cheapest form of labor they could. Initially, native peoples were enslaved in large numbers, women often being sent to southern plantations, while indigenous men were shipped to the West Indies. Excuse me. Ultimately, some 400,000 enslaved Africans were imported, an important and often overlooked aspect of our migration history. Blackness was soon associated with enslavement, to the point that enslaved American Indians were often listed as black. And racial characteristics were attributed to those identified as black in order to maintain what Anthony Angie calls the dynamic of difference necessary to all colonial regimes. Thus, for example, the preamble to South Carolina's 1696 slave code began by noting that the colony couldn't survive without, quote, the labor and service of Negroes and other slaves. By other slaves, of course, they meant indigenous people. You might think that these workers were the ones rendering the land productive in the Lockean sense of the term. However, to avoid conceding that enslaved Africans were entitled to own land, or that they should have any recognized rights at all, the settlers instead constructed the people themselves as a highly volatile and unstable form of property. And this was justified by racializing them as having such barbarous, wild, savage natures as to be wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices of the white settlers, according to the South Carolina Slave Code. Having thus turned people into racialized property, it's not surprising that the legislatures in slaveholding states would classify as black as many people as possible, and we see state laws shifting over time from 1/2 or 1/4 standards to the infamous one-drop rule. So my point here is that the way in which racialized identities has been constructed has relied on these egregious stereotypes, but also has changed with respect to the goals of the settlers. Did they want more land? Did they want more labor? That affected how these racial constructs were created. When chattel slavery was outlawed in the South, we saw the rise of other forms of involuntary labor, most notably the convict leasing system and chain gangs that revitalized Southern agriculture and industry after the Civil War and laid the foundations for today's systems of mass incarceration. In other parts of the country, the settlers cultivated sources of labor that were both readily accessible and easily disposable. As y'all know, with the annexation of Texas, as well as the land ceded by Mexico under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States dramatically expanded its land base. When taking these lands, Anglo settlers described Mexicans as, quote, indolent, slothful, cruel, and cowardly, a race unfit to govern their own land. However, Mexican workers were soon being recruited because they could be paid less than white workers and deported when their labor was not needed. The most dramatic, although certainly not unique, example was in the Great Depression when possibly 1.8 million people of Mexican origin, including many U.S. citizens, were rounded up, loaded on trucks and trains, and summarily deported. Chinese workers, many working under indentures or debt contracts, were similarly racialized and exploited. Between 1852 and 1870, taxes on foreign miners, i.e. all Mexican and Chinese workers, regardless of their actual occupations, accounted for somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of all California state revenues. Those who could not pay the tax were sentenced to provide free labor for the state, much as black convict labor was utilized in the South. Again, racialization provided the justification. Thus, for example, California had a law prohibiting black and Native people from testifying against white defendants in criminal cases. I'd like you to think for just a minute about what that means to not be able to testify against anybody white in court. That meant, as a person of color, that you were completely at their mercy because you had no recourse to the so-called justice system. In 1854, the California Supreme Court ruled that, with respect to this law, the legislature must have intended for it to apply to Chinese as well as black and Native people because they too constituted, quote, degraded tribes who have nothing in common with us. And then when their labor was no longer needed, the Chinese exclusion acts of the 1880s and 90s were justified with imagery of vermin swarming into American communities and yellow hordes waiting to invade. Our history of immigration exclusion, in conjunction with the racial prerequisite to naturalize citizenship that persisted in some form from 1790 to 1952, explains why people of Asian descent, those from Mexico and Central or South America, are so often presumed to be foreign, regardless of how long we've been here. Foreignness has become part of our racial identity and therefore persists. So we can't avoid the fact that racialization is built into the fabric of this country. It was essential to building the country, and it continues to safeguard the status quo. This is a settler colonial state, and the construct of race has been used to justify the occupation of the land, the appropriation of its natural resources, and the exploitation of labor. It's not a nation of immigrants, as they would have us believe. That framing erases indigenous peoples altogether. It glosses over the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. It minimizes the extent to which migration spans the entire spectrum of volition, from workers who have been kidnapped or coerced, to refugees fleeing armed conflict, to those who seize an opportunity for economic advancement. Moreover, settlers are not simply migrants. Settlers came to create a society of their own, a society over which they exercise total control on someone else's land. Settlers create their own economic, political, and legal institutions and prescribe the status and behavior expected of everyone within their claimed jurisdiction. Migrants, by contrast, come to join someone else's society. When they join settler states, they are participating in a process of ongoing colonization, consciously or not, but their relationship to that society is often determined by existing hierarchies of racial privilege and subordination. So it's clear, I think, even from this brief overview, that racism and xenophobia are closely related. Several years ago, I participated in a book talk on Khaled Beydoun's American Islamophobia, and it left me wondering for a long time, Given how effectively racism has been mobilized to exclude and subordinate people, what purposes does xenophobia serve that aren't otherwise served by racism? This is the question I addressed in the paper that was distributed in connection with this talk, and which I'll briefly summarize now. Somewhat surprisingly, xenophobia is not clearly defined in domestic or international law. Tendai Achiume, who is the current UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, observes that it involves attitudes and actions that have the purpose or effect of racialized exclusion of non-nationals, but it goes beyond citizenship to target people based on their actual or perceived foreignness or outsider status. 2 points are worth noting about xenophobia as it's defined. First is that despite the phobia suffix, xenophobia really isn't primarily a type of fear, even irrational or pathological fear. It mobilizes fear, but it's more accurately described, I think, as animus. Second, it's not a natural phenomenon. I often hear people say, it's just human nature. But in many cultures, difference is not presumed to be threatening, and balance between groups, rather than exclusion or hierarchy, is considered optimal. One's identity doesn't have to be formed in opposition to others, unless there's nothing substantive there to begin with. Most manifestations of xenophobia are permeated by racism, and there's a danger in thinking that we can talk about xenophobia apart from racism. Nonetheless, I think it can be useful to distinguish xenophobia from racism in certain respects. I think of these concepts as overlapping circles in a Venn diagram. In 2016, Mutuma Rutere, who was then the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism, observed that while xenophobia is often racialized, manifestations of xenophobia also occur against people of identical physical characteristics, even of shared ancestry, when such people arrive, return, or migrate to states or areas where occupants consider them as outsiders. Conversely, racism often serves to subordinate people who are considered insiders. So sometimes they serve somewhat different purposes, and sometimes one provides cover for the other. Often, xenophobia manifests in situations where overtly race-based exclusion is no longer considered acceptable. Thus, for example, most Americans would not endorse a return to governmental policies explicitly mandating race-based exclusion from housing, healthcare, education, employment, or professional licensing. But when such exclusions are based on citizenship or immigration status, they meet with very little resistance. Xenophobia serves different purposes in different settings, of course. The observations I'd like to share today are limited to what I've seen within the U.S., although I expect that much of this analysis would apply in other settler colonial settings. We know that xenophobia can meet individuals' psychological needs, as when someone attacks outsiders as a way of feeling better about themselves or venting their frustrations. But such attacks take place within cultural and institutional frames, and those are what I think we need to think through. The bottom line for me is that xenophobia persists and takes the form it does because it both legitimizes and empowers the state, and that's what I'd like to talk about now. Legitimacy is a big concern for all settler states. In external or classic colonial settings, the colonizers, as a general rule, exploit the lands, resources, and peoples they encounter, send the profits back to a metropolitan center, and eventually return home themselves. In settler colonialism, by contrast, they come to stay, bringing with them a presumption of sovereign entitlement, an unshakable belief in their divinely ordained right to establish a territorial base and a political state under their exclusive control. To realize these ambitions, here in North America, the colonizers eliminated, as far as practicable, the indigenous owners of the land and asserted jurisdiction over the lands and resources that were being occupied or appropriated. But they haven't been able to establish the legality of their occupation, absent the racist presumptions that underlie the doctrine of discovery and the, quote, civilizing mission of colonialism. We're told that the Anglo-American settlers legitimately acquired land through treaties with indigenous nations, but they have not complied with their obligations under a single one of the approximately 800 ratified and unratified treaties. As of 1970, government lawyers were not able to provide the Indian Claims Commission with any sort of evidence, treaties, or even unilateral acts of Congress to support the United States claims to about 1/3 of the territory of the so-called lower 48 U.S. states. This makes the settlers uncomfortable, and it's one reason they go to great lengths to erase indigenous presence and recast themselves as native to the land. This sentiment was crudely captured in former U.S. Senator Rick Santorum's statement made just last April that, quote, "We came here and created a blank slate. We birthed a nation from nothing." But it's a claim that has permeated the dominant narrative since John Smith's 1614 appeal to recruit settlers to what he described as a land, quote, "planted with gardens and cornfields, and well inhabited with a goodly, strong, and well-proportioned people." His favorite, he said, of all the lands he had yet seen not inhabited. Having declared themselves the native and therefore legitimate inhabitants, the colonizers continue to assert their self-ascribed prerogative to decide who may or may not or must live within their borders. Any challenges to their occupation become invasions, and any actions taken against those who don't belong, from their perspective, become self-defense, as we've seen from the massacres that are still called Indian Wars to former President Trump's characterization of migrants and asylum seekers at the southern borders as an invasion. Since the 1960s, colonialism has been proscribed in international law, but the world's most powerful settler states have avoided the international mandate to decolonize, and they remain intent on justifying their continued occupation of indigenous peoples' lands and resources. Xenophobia contributes to this effort because it presumes the legitimacy of the state and focuses attention on specific measures of inclusion or exclusion. Thus, for example, there's been much public debate in the United States about specific immigration policies or whether a border wall will keep out criminals and drug dealers. But the construct of the border itself is rarely questioned. So there's the role that xenophobia plays in legitimizing or helping people to presume the legitimacy of the state. The other function, I think, big picture function that xenophobia serves is to empower the state. And that happens in 4 ways that I find particularly significant, and I'd like to just run through those quickly for you now. First of all, xenophobia galvanizes a national response that can be used, when desired, to counteract the internal divisions that are promoted by racialization. Racism divides the population, making it easier to exploit or dispossess racialized others. But when pushed too far, communities of color have consistently demonstrated that they will rise up from the earliest slave revolts through contemporary urban rebellions. Mobilizing against external enemies diverts attention from internal fissures and holds out the promise that those who are internally subjugated will be treated with more respect if they join forces with those who historically have oppressed them. We see this argument invoked, for example, in the recruitment of people of color into the U.S. military. A second point is that xenophobia strengthens the state by sanctioning the use of raw power against racialized others in ways that are not otherwise considered acceptable. Racism, once given free rein, is now curtailed, at least nominally, by the international condemnation of apartheid, by domestic guarantees of equal protection, and by an ideological narrative that posits equality, or at least equal opportunity, as an American value. But since the 1880s, the Supreme Court has consistently invoked the plenary power doctrine, which rests on explicitly xenophobic depictions of the other, to allow Congress and the executive absolute authority over colonized peoples and migrants. In the immigration context, it was first invoked in the Chinese exclusion cases, and it continues to be relied on today to allow people to be caged indefinitely without due process, to separate children from their families, to pass laws that apply retroactively, to deport long-term residents, and all of the other forms of immigration policy or practice that would otherwise be unconstitutional or a violation of some treaty. The plenary power doctrine has allowed the courts to abdicate responsibility for enforcing those sources of law. A third point is that xenophobia facilitates the construction of enemies that are more sophisticated than racism usually permits, and it makes it easier to engage in more drastic responses to those enemies. Racism tends to depict the other as less than. Some of these depictions, less human, less sensitive, less concerned with morality, make it easier to kill or brutally subjugate those who are deemed other. But the portrayal of racialized others as less intelligent, less competent, and less civilized also reduces the perceived need to develop and deploy highly sophisticated and expensive military technology or an intelligence apparatus capable of minutely monitoring the population. To facilitate the funding and expansion of the internal security state, as well as global military power, highly competent and dangerous enemies need to be invoked. One might look for a clash of civilizations. And in this sense, Islam makes the ideal enemy, for it represents a large swath of humanity, often misunderstood as a unified civilization, with access to wealth, education, and cutting-edge technology, against which American society may be mobilized. By associating terrorist attacks with Islam, rather than, say, white supremacist organizations, xenophobia paves the way for both a mind-boggling military budget and the extension of the security state into every nook and cranny of American life. Inevitably, the tactics and weaponry developed for use against external enemies are utilized at home. To give you just one example, in 2016, as I expect you remember, the indigenous-led opposition to pipeline construction at Standing Rock in North Dakota was met by heavily militarized police who arrived in armored vehicles and assaulted the water protectors with purportedly less than lethal weapons, LRAD sound devices, and water cannons. In this effort, state, local, and federal officials from dozens of agencies implemented military-style counterterrorism measures with the help of Tiger Swan, a defense contractor active in the global war on terror. And in turn, Tiger Swan described the water protectors who were camped on unceded indigenous lands as, quote, an ideologically driven insurgency with a strong religious component, and explicitly likened them to jihadist fighters. Finally, xenophobia facilitates the ongoing operations of empire by diverting attention from their real costs. It makes it easier for the consequences of empire to be overlooked or attributed to its victims. Since the end of World War II, the United States has engaged in undeclared wars in Southeast Asia, Central America, and the Middle East. It has occupied and colonized islands in the Pacific, stationed troops around the globe, and supported coups in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. These ventures have had devastating effects around the globe and inevitably collateral consequences for those residing within the United States. To deflect responsibility for the blowback of empire, American political leaders have consistently depicted the problems as external, created by foreigners, and best solved by banishing them from the country. Consider the current crisis at the southern border. In the 1980s and early 90s, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador were engulfed in civil wars between U.S.-sponsored military dictatorships and leftist guerrillas, the guerrillas often being indigenous peoples who are attempting to remain on their traditional lands. Since then, as journalist Nina Lakhani puts it, unresolved inequalities and amnesties which let war criminals escape justice have left these states in the hands of a, quote, toxic mix of warring gangs and corrupt security forces. This in turn has fueled the violence and social turmoil which generates migration toward the southern border of the United States. And even when we start to look at that, what's often left unsaid is that, for example, more than half the refugees who fled El Salvador's civil war settled in Los Angeles in the 1980s, living in very harsh conditions with very little support. Many of the young men formed or joined gangs to survive. They were subsequently incarcerated at high rates, especially with California's 3 strikes laws, and then they were deported following the Clinton administration's 1996 immigration reforms. As reported by scholars and journalists, they returned to their home countries with no resources, homes, or connections other than their gang ties, largely to MS-13 and M18, which have become 2 of Central America's largest and most powerful criminal enterprises, which engage in extortion, drug trafficking, and the forced recruitment of teenagers and young children. These dynamics, of course, propel more refugees to the U.S. border. But rather than acknowledging any responsibility for the situation, American leaders invoke xenophobic stereotypes to exclude and criminalize the living legacies of U.S. foreign policy. So, why does this all matter? First, if we can understand what gives racism and xenophobia their staying power, I think it will change our thinking about how they are best dismantled. Thus, for example, in this society, some variant of assimilationism or multiculturalism is usually presumed to be the most effective way of countering xenophobia. If the problem is exclusion, then the solution must be inclusion. However, to the extent that xenophobia exists to legitimize and strengthen the settler state, solutions that reinforce the status quo are likely to further entrench xenophobia. That means that assimilationism or approaches that focus solely on inclusion may in fact exacerbate rather than remediate the problem. Assimilationism is an illusory construct because, as Lorenzo Veracini points out, it requires not only the willingness and ability of those who are deemed other to conform to mainstream expectations, but critically, a desire on the part of insiders to accept and absorb them. And in U.S. history, such acceptance has been predictably precluded by racism and the desire to maintain white privilege. Even more significantly, assimilationism imposes a requirement of cultural homogeneity that strips people of languages, cultures, histories, and epistemologies that diverge from those of the settler class. This helps us understand, I think, why xenophobia is supported, or at least tolerated, by insiders across the political spectrum. David Kim and Ronald Sunstrom provide what they call a caricature of the political struggle between, quote, the demand for one blood and one mind. As they put it, one blood, represented perhaps by the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, strives for the purification of the body politic from sullying racial inferiors, while one mind, they say, seeks a single shared culture for the nation with a corresponding sense of the alienness or presumptive wrongness of other cultural forms. One is exclusive, the other inclusive, but both are insisting on cultural homogeneity. This is not genuine inclusion, but forced transformation of the other. This was a policy of the American Indian boarding schools, the ones where they're now finding the mass graves of children. The schools whose official motto was, quote, kill the Indian, save the man in every child. Really respecting human rights, especially in the immigration context, requires us to go beyond reflexive assimilationism. And that means, I think, being willing to question some of our basic presumptions, including how we understand the constructs of states, borders, and national identity. As Tendai Yachiume notes, fully confronting the challenges of xenophobia and the racism that attends it will require a radical rethinking of the relationship between territory and political community. A radical rethinking of the relationship between territory and political community. There are no quick fixes, but we can begin this process by considering the stories we tell ourselves and others, about which stories have been planted in us and why, which stories we've planted in ourselves and why. The stories we choose to live by have consequences, and that's why they're so intensely contested. Underlying both racism and xenophobia, particularly as they manifest in the context of immigration, is a deeply rooted and triumphalist narrative of American exceptionalism. That story is being challenged by grassroots as well as theoretical efforts, insisting that accurate histories of people of color be included in the stories we tell. In Texas, you've seen virulent reactions to critical race theory and to acknowledging the history of slavery, for that matter, just as we have here in Georgia. Those who are reacting recognize that the teaching of diverse histories is a dangerous path. Dangerous because so much of the dominant narrative has been built on a foundation of denial and half-truths. And it's very difficult to let just a little bit of honesty in the door. Unraveling contemporary manifestations of racism and xenophobia will, in fact, take us back to the genocidal policies of the earliest European settlers and the reality that we still live on indigenous lands subjected to colonial occupation. It will make us question not just current immigration policies, but the legitimacy of the border itself. Nonetheless, as Okri observes, if we refuse to face any of our awkward and deepest truths, then sooner or later we're going to have to become deaf and blind, and then eventually we're going to have to silence our dreams and the dreams of others. I don't think that's what any of us want to do, and we don't have to. When I saw that the title of this series is Responsibility in Immigration, I was reminded of Stokely Carmichael's insistence that the definition of ourselves, the road we pursue, the goals we seek are our responsibility. We can choose to defend the stories of those who have been excluded or silenced, and we can choose to change the stories we live by. With that, I'd like to just say I'm honored to be part of this series, and I welcome your questions.
Now we open the floor now for questions. Any questions? Can I begin with one? I guess I want to, since I don't see any questions here, I'm sort of breaking the rules here a little bit. I want to begin with, and you touched upon this a little bit at the end of your presentation, is the role of the current attack on critical race theory. Can you help us understand what you mean by critical race theory, for one, as a point of departure, but sort of link that with the fear of xenophobia and how that might play out in along the lines of immigration, migration, that sort of thing.
Well, I think we have to start from the understanding that what is being called critical race theory and attacked by various state legislatures and in certain sectors of the media and by various politicians is not actually critical race theory, right? Critical race theory is an approach that was developed by legal scholars. Well, it's probably always been there amongst various scholars of colors. I think of W.B. Du Bois, the incredible public intellectual and sociologist. I mean, what he was doing was critical race theory, right? But we only started calling it critical race theory in the 90s. As a school of thought emerged to respond to critical legal studies, which was looking at the way in which the law operated in real life, but wasn't taking into account from the perspective of scholars of color the role of race. And critical race theory was developed essentially to ask the question, what does race have to do with it? And so we look and we analyze situations and we say, what does race have to do with this? And if it has nothing to do with it, we say fine and move on, right? But in many cases, given the history of the society, we see that race does have something to do with it. And we start to try to unpack that and to reveal it. What is being attacked is race consciousness, and it's being framed as racism, which is really quite ironic because those who are attacking critical race theory are challenging it as being essentialist, whereas in fact critical race theory says that race is not a thing, it's a construct. And Christopher Rufo can be credited really with the current attacks. He was a journalist, a former, maybe still current documentarian, a young sort of social commentator who decided to put together a program to attack the emphasis on diversity and inclusion, sort of race-conscious remedies, et cetera, that were being discussed in the sort of post-George Floyd, Black Lives Matter movement era. And he decided that critical race theory was a great label. And he says, there's a recent New Yorker article you might look at if you're interested in this topic, where he comes out and specifically says, we are going to create a bucket, right? And we're going to call it critical race theory. And we're going to start putting things into it, because what we want is when the public hears something crazy, we want them to think critical race theory.
Mm.
So he made a plea for this position. I think it was on the Tucker Carlson show. It was on Fox News on September 2nd, and urged the White House to come out with an executive order banning critical race theory and the use of federal money for that. 2 days later, Donald Trump did so, right? And since then, we've had this proliferation of attacks on critical race theory in various state legislatures and by various politicians. So what they are trying to do is they are using critical race theory as a convenient label, sort of like communism was used in the 50s, right? To say everything bad that you see happening around you can be blamed on critical race theory. And therefore, it's wrong, you know, any kind of race consciousness, any attempt to engage in racial remediation or movements for reparation or any of that is part of this un-American attack. And so, you know, they're using it to counter the strength that has been growing in the attempts to address racism. And I think that that's equally true with respect to xenophobia, right? That this consciousness of the importance of the roles that are played by people from all different parts of the world, the need to have humane and human rights compliant immigration policies is all, you know, it's much easier to attack if you label it as part of, you know, people of color coming to take over the United States and destroy our way of life. So they're trying to lump it all together.
Okay. We have now a number of questions, so let me try to get to some of these here. Can you speculate on the way xenophobia, racism might work as we see humans literally launched into space? Elon Musk wants to colonize Mars, and this week we've seen billionaires become space tourists. They're already mining contracts for asteroids.
That's an interesting question. You know, and the first thing that pops into my head with that question is the old Gil Scott-Heron song about Whitey's on the moon. And my sister, you know, and a rat done bit my sister Nell, right? And Whitey's on the moon. So there's that whole dimension of sort of a diversion, right? A diversion of social resources and interest and public imagination into something outside of the real problems that are being faced by people here. I do think that obviously that the use of the term alien to refer to people who aren't US citizens or who don't have documented status here is an attempt to invoke that fear of the other. And what we see with the space programs is sort of this notion that, of course, as humans, we would want to go out and conquer the other, to conquer the unknown. And, you know, I think it all plays into that larger sort of cosmology that has come with Western colonization. I'm not sure that really got to the question, but I don't know.
Let's move on. Do you see religious patterns and support for xenophobia? I'm not trying to praise or blame groups, but can we learn if there are differences? Can we learn why?
Certain constructions of our understandings of ourselves and the world around us that have religious foundations certainly promote xenophobia and racism more than other constructions. And of course, I really, you know, don't want to lump, you know, all Christians, all Muslims, all whatever into one big category, because that's very problematic. But if you look, for example, in the underlying Judeo-Christian tradition of, you know, if you go back to the book of Genesis and look at the notion of God created the world and then made man and then gave man dominion over all living beings and the earth, you see in that process a worldview which is hierarchical, which puts God at the top and human beings, you know, next to God, created in God's image and being godlike to the extent we are like God and not like nature, which is under us, and our job is to dominate nature. It creates a very hierarchical framework. And once you've got a hierarchical framework like that, then it's very easy to say, well, everything belongs in this hierarchy. And within humans, there are hierarchies of humans. And there's, humans who are closer to God and further from God, et cetera, et cetera. So religious framings have been used in these ways. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily inherent to any given religion, but, they certainly promote or make it easier to promote these types of exclusionary understandings. And then, of course, there are sort of what you might classify as religious understandings of people who understand themselves to be part of nature, to be related to all other human beings, to see their goal as bringing harmony and balance into the universe. And that, of course, helps to counter racist and xenophobic tendencies.
Okay. Let me move to another question here. How do we begin to address our history of forced migration? In addition to changing the stories we tell ourselves, what path do you see for helping those wronged?
That's a great question. I think that first, we have to start by acknowledging the truth, right? And being willing to deal with the implications of the truth. And that's something that's very important. That's why people resist these stories, right? Is because we don't want to have to deal with their implications. But once we do, then we have to look at, what caused that forced migration and what resulted from it. So if we're talking, for example, in terms of reparations for enslaved Africans and their, for the descendants of enslaved Africans, that's one example, one very large example of forced migration. We can look at the value of that labor. We can calculate it in economic terms, which leads us to a mind-boggling economic calculation, right? Even if we can't do it accurately, it's mind-boggling. It's huge. And even though we know that not that many billions and trillions of dollars are going to be restored to the descendants of those enslaved folks, it gives us a starting place, right? This is not Black people asking for charity from white folks. This is a recognition of where the wealth of the most privileged has come from and how it was stolen wealth. Okay, we can do that. But I think beyond that, we can look at, we have to, I think, look at the history of colonization, right? People of African descent who at least trace their ancestry to the slave trade here are also colonized peoples, right? They are here because of the colonization of Africa and the forced transportation of indigenous African peoples to this continent. And that means that they have just as much of a right to decolonization as anybody else. They have just as much of a right to decolonization as people in those African countries that were colonized.
Mhm.
Right? So it's not just about, well, we're all Americans now and we have to figure it out. What does that mean to have the right to self-determination? None of us have a pat answer for that, but we can start to think about it. We can start to think about the fact that it's not just a question of we want equal treatment within the society as it is structured now. We can think about we want the ability to have some kind of political, economic, social, cultural autonomy. We want to have some kind of, we want to be able to exercise our self-determination in various ways. And I don't have the answer to that. No, none of us can answer that question for anybody else, right? Self-determination is something that has to come from the self. But we can open our minds up to that, and we can stop characterizing people who insist on their cultural identity as being extremists, right? The FBI's recently had this program to target Black identity extremists. What did that mean? It meant people that it saw as Black nationalists, who weren't necessarily doing anything, right? But they were saying that the government saw as a threat people who actively created an identity that was distinct from the identity that the state was trying to impose on them. And we need to counter that, right? We need to say that there's all sorts of layers and dimensions to this forced migration that we have not even started to unravel.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question. When talking to someone who does not understand the total picture of xenophobia's role in where we are now, how was assimilation used in getting minoritized or minorities to enlist in the modern military? I'm not quite sure how military prior to World War II. I would like to have an understanding to better prepare to respond to questions.
Okay. I think that assimilationism has been used as sort of a carrot to say, we're not really racist or xenophobic here, right? It's just that we have this civilization and this culture, and if you want to be part of it, you're welcome in it. You just need to assimilate to it. It's part of the sort of the civilizing mission of colonization around the world. It's also part of this notion of American exceptionalism, that we have this culture and this society that's superior to others. And so, of course, other people want to come and join us, and they're welcome to, as long as they actually join us and adapt to our way of life and our values. And then, of course, that there's a big contrast between that and the way people are actually treated. And so the storyline for a long time has been, well, if you would just assimilate, you could become a part of our culture, right? Since 1790, we had laws that said only free white persons could become naturalized citizens. That was eventually tweaked and changed, but it took a long time. And so who's a white person, right, for purposes of naturalization? And for a long time in those cases, the courts were saying, well, these people can't become naturalized citizens because it's not that we're racist or anything, right? But they can't become naturalized citizens because they can't assimilate. They're incapable of assimilating. And then when along came people who were thoroughly assimilated, nobody could question that. Then all of a sudden they were like, ooh, but they're not white people, right? So they still can't become citizens. American Indian removal was conditioned on assimilationism, right? They can't assimilate, these savage people. But the problem with the Cherokees in North Georgia was that they were too assimilated. They had done too good of a job, right? Becoming so much like the settlers that there was no excuse left for removing them when the settlers discovered that there might be gold on their land. But still, we get that same story being told to us. If you would just assimilate, and here's how you can prove your loyalty. If you join the military, then you'll be respected as a veteran, whereas otherwise you're just a random person of color on the street. Within the Japanese American internment, there were big debates amongst Japanese Americans who were interned, right? We were told, and we were telling ourselves, right? Many among us were saying, we have to prove our loyalty, then we'll be accepted. So there were, people signing up from within concentration camps in the US to go and fight in Europe, right? The same story is told consistently, and migrants today and refugees are told, well, you can come here, but you have to assimilate, right? You have to speak English, and it's not our fault if you're being discriminated against because you don't speak English well, or whatever, right? So it's like this constant theme that justifies ongoing racist and xenophobic treatment of people, but it blames it on the victims. You have failed to sufficiently assimilate.
Okay. I think we have reached the end of our hour. It's okay. I want to thank all who made this event possible behind the scenes, especially the Luz Foundation for Theology. And of course, I want to thank our presenter today, Professor Saito, for an engaging and stimulating presentation. You've given us a lot to think about. There's some other questions that we just couldn't get to that I think are very important along the lines of religious dimensions, the role of Puerto Rico and Christianity and that sort of thing. Those were some excellent questions, but we don't have time. I do want to remind all to register for the next webinar event on October 7th. 2021 from 11 to 12 p.m. Central Time. And that will be entitled Children Crisscrossing Borders in the Americas by Professor Iracema Coronado, Director of the School of Transborder Studies at Arizona State University. So again, thank you, Dr. Saito, and for again, an engaged presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.